They called it love, but history would remember it as something else. In a remote corner of America where silence stretches across fields and secrets rot beneath the soil, a family bound itself not by choice, but by blood. Too much blood. What began as a union, celebrated in whispers and defended by tradition, grew into something monstrous, an experiment in loyalty, heritage, and decay. And at the center of it all was a marriage that, even today, nearly a century later, is spoken of only in shivers, the most inbred marriage in U.S. history. You see, America hides its scars well. We like to imagine this nation as a story of progress, of fresh starts, of bloodlines free from the old sins of Europe. But dig deep enough, and you'll find that the soil itself is soaked in the same taboos that haunted royal dynasties across the ocean. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, generations folding in on themselves until identity crumbled into deformity. We're told it didn't happen here, but that is a lie. This story doesn't come from the halls of kings and queens. It comes from the backroads of Appalachia, from rural towns where isolation was a prison and family was all anyone had. Out there, marriage wasn't about romance, it was about survival. Land, property, labor, and blood, all kept tightly within the family, guarded like treasure. No outsiders, no fresh blood. And over time, that loyalty to kinship twisted into something darker. The marriage I'm about to tell you about was more than a union. It was a collapse. A brother who became a husband, a sister who became a wife, two souls raised under the same roof, bound by the same parents, who crossed a line that nature itself had drawn in stone, and what followed was a descent not just for them, but for every child born of their bond. The human body is fragile when the gene pool shrinks, and this family would become lowered, vying evidence of what happens when love, secrecy, and bloodlines suffocate each other. What's chilling is not just the deformities or the whispers or the way the town tried to bury the truth. What's chilling is how ordinary it seemed at the time. No one stepped in, no one stopped it. They lived, married, and had children under the same laws as anyone else. And yet behind their door, history was being written. The darkest marriage America had ever seen. The names have nearly been erased, scrubbed from local records, left to rot in the margins of dusty courthouses. But in fragments, in faded letters and birth certificates, the truth leaks through. This was not just a rumor passed down by gossips. It was real, documented, and, for a brief moment in time, whispered about openly before vanishing again under layers of denial. The husband and wife were siblings, brother and sister born into a family already tangled by cousin marriages. Their parents had been related, their grandparents too. By the time these two crossed the final line, their bloodline was already unraveling. Their union only quickened the collapse. Imagine the ceremony. If there was one, it could not have been grand. No flowers, no church bells, no crowded pews filled with smiling relatives. Likely, it was quiet, private, perhaps even hidden. The town may have known, but the town kept silent, because silence is easier than confrontation. And in places where everyone shares blood with everyone else, who has the right to judge? That silence, that complicity, was its own kind of crime. Soon came the children, babies born under a heavy shadow, carrying the burden of decisions they never made. Some did not survive infancy, others did, but with features that betrayed the truth of their parentage, eyes set too close or too far apart, jaws that never aligned, bodies frail and prone to sickness. In photographs, those rare grainy images that survive, you can see the evidence etched into their faces. They stare back at us from the past like ghosts, proof that the human body cannot escape the consequences of secrets buried in the blood. But the horror wasn't just physical, it was psychological. To be born into a world where the walls of your family are also the bars of your prison is to live a life shaped by shame and silence. Neighbors would not speak of it openly, yet the children grew up knowing something was wrong. Whispers followed them to school, lingered in church pews, trailed them down dirt roads. They were not just children. They were symbols, living reminders of a taboo everyone wanted to ignore, but no one could unsee. The story of this marriage did not remain confined to a single household. It began to seep outward, contaminating cousins, nephews, nieces. Entire branches of the family tree became twisted, knotted, unrecognizable, and when the town tried to forget, when the names were erased from obituaries and gravestones, the land itself remembered. The bloodlines remained. The descendants are still out there. What makes this story unbearable is not only that it happened, but how easily it could. Isolation breeds desperation. In parts of America where mountains cut people off from the world, where roads washed out in the spring and winters froze the land into silence, families turned inward. The outside world was too far away, too dangerous, too uncertain. Blood became both a bond and a curse. You could not leave, and no one came in. Generations lived and died within walking distance of the same cabins, the same fields, the same cemetery plots. It was a closed circle, and when circles tighten too much, they collapse in on themselves. For the brother and sister who chose marriage, perhaps it didn't feel like a choice at all. Imagine their lives, 2 children raised in a house where cousins were already husband and wife, where family trees looked more like loops than branches. To them, perhaps the boundary had never existed. If everyone around them was connected by blood, then where exactly was the line drawn? Love, desire, and survival blurred together until taboo dissolved into something that seemed natural. To us, it is unthinkable. To them, it was inevitable. And yet, inevitability does not make it less grotesque. The children bore the cost, their bodies unraveling with each generation. Doctors in nearby towns would occasionally see them, strange cases of deformity, illnesses without clear cause, mental development slowed to a crawl. The doctors would scribble notes, puzzled, but rarely asked questions that went too deep. To pry into a family's secrets was to invite the wrath of an entire clan, and in those rural stretches, a family's wrath could be dangerous. Better to write unknown cause and move on. This is how the marriage survived, through silence, through shame, through the willingness of outsiders to look away, and as the decades passed, the bloodline thickened, with its own sickness. Some children never learned to speak clearly, others never left their homes, shut away from the world to avoid stares and questions. A few grew into adulthood, but the signs were always there. The slack jaws, the vacant eyes, the awkward, stumbling movements of bodies carrying too much genetic weight. They were living archives of their parents' sin. Still, there is something cruelly human in all of it. These were not monsters. They were people, born into a cycle they did not begin, bound by circumstances they could not escape. The horror lies not in their existence, but in the fact that a community, and perhaps a nation, allowed them to exist unseen. Their marriage was not just a private mistake. It was a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of American life. The more you dig into this story, the more unsettling it becomes, because it was not just a marriage, it was the beginning of a dynasty that should never have existed. Children became parents, parents became grandparents, and the cycle repeated. Each time the blood grew weaker, the faces more distorted, the minds slower to grasp what the world outside already knew. And yet the family carried on, stubborn, defiant, as if the act of survival itself was proof that nothing was wrong. Neighbors watched. They saw the children limping through fields, their eyes not quite aligned, their voices slurred, their laughter strange and unsettling. Some whispered the truth in kitchens late at night, telling children to stay away from that house on the edge of town. Others invented stories to explain it, tales of curses or punishments from God, because sometimes superstition is easier than reality. To admit what was really happening meant admitting a truth far worse, that this was allowed, that it was not stopped, that America itself had corners so dark they rivaled the old horrors of European courts. When outsiders eventually stumbled upon the family, they didn't know what they were seeing. Travelers, journalists, even lawmen sometimes passed through and they left disturbed, whispering about the strange clan hidden in the hills. A few photographs survive, faces half lit by sun, expressions caught between innocence and something far more haunting. They are difficult to look at, not because of cruelty, but because of recognition. You can see the echoes of what might have been normal, twisted just enough to remind you how fragile humanity really is. The brother and sister who began it all did not live to see the full ruin of their choice, but their children did, and their grandchildren. Each new generation carried a heavier weight, as though nature itself was trying to bring the bloodline to an end. Scientists would later describe the results with clinical terms: genetic bottleneck, recessive mutations, congenital disorders, cold words for what in reality was suffering etched into flesh. And yet, in the quiet of their home, they were still a family. They ate together, they prayed together, they buried their dead together. For them, this was not horror. It was life. Only we, looking back, see the tragedy for what it was. The most inbred marriage in American history. A union that scarred generations and left behind an echo that still haunts the land. What chills me most is how the legacy lingered long after the first brother and sister were gone. The bloodline did not end. It spread quietly, drifting into nearby towns, into marrying with distant cousins who were only slightly less entangled. Each branch carried traces of the collapse, hidden in faces, in bodies, in minds that never fully escaped the shadows of the original union. Even today, if you search long enough, if you look into the census rolls and marriage certificates of those hills, you'll find the echoes. The names change, the faces change, but the blood remembers. And there is something else, something more disturbing than the deformities or the silence. It is the idea that this marriage was not an isolated mistake, but a reflection of a larger truth. America likes to bury its family horrors, to paint itself as pure and separate from the old world sins of kings marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins. But the reality is that our soil holds just as many skeletons. From Appalachia to the Deep South, from forgotten valleys to small rural towns, inbreeding was not rare. It was survival, it was property, it was secrecy, and it left scars that no one wants to talk about. The most inbred marriage in US history is remembered because it was so extreme, so grotesque in its outcome, that it could not be denied. But for every story like this one that surfaces, there are countless others erased, hidden in records no one has digitized, in family Bibles kept in locked trunks, in whispered warnings passed down through generations. This marriage was not an anomaly, it was a window into a hidden world we prefer not to see. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run? Or would you have stayed, trapped by silence and fear, repeating the same cycle because here was no other choice? These questions are not just about the past, they are about us. About how far we are willing to go to protect family, even when family becomes a prison. About how much we are willing to look away when horror hides behind a door we do not want to open. The story of this marriage is not simply history, it is a mirror. And when you look into it, you may not like what stares back. Over time, the family became less a collection of people and more a legend whispered across America's backroads. Locals told stories of the clan in the hills, spoken in tones of warning, as if even the memory carried a curse. Children dared each other to walk past the property at night, swearing they saw faces in the windows, faces that didn't look quite right. Hunters claimed they heard strange cries echoing through the woods, neither human nor animal. The marriage had ended, but its legacy became folklore, as though the land itself refused to let it die. But folklore has a way of protecting us from the truth. Behind the stories was something far worse than monsters. It was people, fragile, broken, and abandoned by the world. The brother and sister at the heart of this union are long gone, their names buried, their graves unmarked or forgotten. Yet the questions they leave behind remain heavy. Did they feel guilt as their children grew sickly, as their faces betrayed the secret they thought they could hide? Did they pray for forgiveness, or did they convince themselves it was love? We cannot know, But history is not written only by what people say, it is written in the bodies of their descendants. Researchers who later traced the family tree described it with words that chilled even scientists. Collapsed lineage, severe recessive concentration, genetic degradation. These are sterile phrases, stripped of emotion. But behind them was pain, confusion, and lives half-lived. Imagine being a child born from such a bond, wanting nothing but a normal life, yet carrying the mark of generations who chose blood over survival. The shame alone must have been suffocating. The haunting part is this: they were never supposed to be remembered. Their names were nearly erased, their faces tucked away in dusty albums, their history smothered by silence. But the truth has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. The most inbred marriage in American history could not remain buried, because it is not just their story, it is a warning. A reminder of what happens when tradition becomes obsession, when silence becomes complicity, when love twists itself into something unrecognizable. And so, the marriage that should have been forgotten endures, not in celebration, but in whispers, not in pride, but in horror. It survives because we need it to, because to look away would be to forget that beneath America's proud history lies another one, darker, hidden, and written in blood, that was never meant to mingle. Now we stand at the end of their story, and yet it does not feel like an ending. It feels like a door left half open, creaking in the wind, daring us to look inside. The most inbred marriage in U.S. history is not just an isolated tale buried in some rural archive. It is part of a larger American silence, one that stretches across valleys, farms, and forgotten towns. We do not speak of these things, because to speak of them is to admit they happened here, in the land we call new, pure, and free. But purity is a myth, and freedom, for families like this, was nothing more than a cage built out of isolation and shame. The brother and sister who began it all are gone, but the truth of their union lingers like a stain on the soil. The children they brought into the world carried their burden until death, and their descendants, knowingly or not, still walk among us. You may have passed one without realizing it. A face in the crowd that seemed just a little unusual, a neighbor who lived a little too far from town, who kept their world hidden. We convince ourselves such things no longer happen. But history has a way of repeating itself when the conditions return, when isolation deepens, when silence grows heavy, when the walls of family close too tightly around those inside. This story, haunting as it is, forces us to confront a truth we would rather bury. The greatest horrors are not found in myths or monsters, but in choices made behind closed doors, passed down through bloodlines, invisible until it is too late. The most inbred marriage in American history is proof that even in the land of progress, the past can twist itself into the present, leaving scars that never heal. If you've listened this far, you've walked through a history most would rather leave untouched. You've seen the cost of silence, the ruin of tradition, and the way love can curdle into something unspeakable. This was not just their story. It is ours. A reminder that the darkest truths are not buried overseas, but here beneath our own soil. And sometimes, if you dig deep enough, the land will whisper them back to you.